Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the second part of this training on the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Also, thanks to everyone who filled in our feedback form yesterday. We really appreciate that. I did notice that one person said they were still a bit lost with the acronyms. So that's completely understandable. It is really an alphabet soup of all the different guidance and standards and standard setters and organizations working on this. So we will pop into the chat a few times a list of acronyms that we have on our website. Vanina, if you can find that, that'd be great. If not, I'll go find it a bit later once I'm done my part, and we'll pop that into the chat a few times throughout, so that if you are confused about any of the acronyms, that's a good place to start so you can get an overview of all of them. But on top of that, please just feel free to ask. So if anything's a bit confusing, if anything's a little bit too much, we're here live with you. So please don't hesitate to pop that in the Q&A so that we can answer those questions for you. All right. So as we get started today, I just want to thank, of course, all of our partners. As we said yesterday, this has been really a group effort of putting this training together. So we've been working very closely with the IFC and multiple teams at the IFC, but then also the UN Environment Program's Finance Initiative, which, as I said yesterday, has a program specifically on TCFD for banks, so climate disclosure really for banks, and CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project. Thank you to those partners. And then, of course, thank you to our co-host as well, the SME Finance Forum at the IFC as part of the World Bank. So I guess more acronyms there, but thanks so much for your collaboration. It's been such a joy working with Carla and Mr. Juan T and the team at the SME Finance Forum. So we look forward to continuing our collaboration together. Now, just to get us started as an introduction, you have similar names here as we did yesterday. So just as a reminder, my name is Tiffany Grabsky, and I'm the head of the SSE Academy, where we run a number of trainings. So please feel free to visit our website if you want to learn more about the SSE Academy. I'm also joined here with my colleague Vanina Vajetsi, and then we have our colleagues from UNEP-FI back again from their TCFD program. So we have Maheen, who's here and helping answer all your questions that you might have in the Q&A. Thanks so much, Maheen. And we have Wenmin, who's also here answering questions, but we'll be presenting some topics to you today later and doing an exercise with you at the end of this session. So thanks everyone for joining to present today. As with last time, a few minor housekeeping issues. So we have the exact same as yesterday, but a slight reminder that we are here to interact with you. We know there's a lot of content to absorb, and it's a long time to have people speaking at you. So please feel free to ask us questions. If something's not making sense, go ahead and drop that in the Q&A. If you're having trouble with the platform, go ahead and put that in the chat box, and we'll make sure we can help you make sure you're finding everything you can. A few of you have been asking for the handout. So Vanina will be sharing the handout from yesterday with you. We also have a handout from today. And those handouts have a little bit more explanation than what you're seeing on your screen. So that can be helpful, good resource as you move forward. Also, we will again be taking a 5-minute break around the halfway point, and that's just to give you a moment if you need to use the restroom, find a coffee or tea, or do a quick stretch before we dive into the second half of the training material. And as with yesterday, we will be providing certificates for this training program. We do need you to fill out that Google form. However, that's part of the certification process. We need to get some feedback from you and have you reflect a little bit about your learning. So when we finish this session, we will be sending you again, like last time, a link to the Google form. And once you fill that in, you'll get a certificate within about a week. But please do fill that certificate in within a week. Otherwise, you won't get a certificate for this training. Okay, so what are we going to cover today? So yesterday, those of you who were here with us, you'll remember we really gave a pretty broad introduction of what the TCFD is and where it came from. Then we looked at the first two pillars of the TCFD, which was governance and strategy. Now there's four pillars of the TCFD. So today we're going to go into those next two. And so we're really looking at risk management and metrics and targets. So before we dive into those core pillars, we're going to give you a bit of an overview of the TCFD for those who maybe found it to be a bit much yesterday, a good refresher for you, and those who weren't here yesterday to give you a quick overview so that you're not starting from nothing. Then we're going to dig into those last two core pillars of the TCFD, the risk management and the metrics and targets, with a reminder that these are all interlinked. So one pillar doesn't really operate alone. You can't have metrics and targets that work without the correct governance in place, and your strategy is not going to be implemented if you don't have the tone from the top and the governments as well as the risk management to go along with that strategy. So all of this works together. We're just breaking it into the targets so that you can understand the individual recommended disclosures that come from the TCFD. In our second half of the session today, we're going to dig into certain aspects of particularly those metrics and targets and the risk management that we find people have the most questions about and that want the most information on. So that is first and foremost net zero targets. You've probably heard of a net zero target. Maybe your bank has a net zero target. So let's look at exactly what that means and how do you achieve net zero. And then also a transition plan. So it's actually quite impractical to set a target without a plan on how to get there. So transition plans are really setting through those plans to move forward and transition to net zero or to a low carbon economy. So we'll have a bit of a discussion on that as well and do an exercise together to look at the different strategies that you can use to move towards net zero. As with last time, we end our presentation with a number of resources you can use. We had to skip through those very quickly yesterday, but hopefully today we have a little bit more time to go through each of those different resources with you. Oops. Okay. So today we have, again, 4 learning objectives. I was happy to see that most of you that filled in the survey had felt that you did learn a fair bit on these particular objectives from yesterday. We have new objectives today. So what we want to look at today, or hope to help you do today, is to be able to identify practices to manage climate-related financial risks and opportunities that face the banking sector. We also look to help you understand what measurements are appropriate and effective in measuring and setting targets for climate resilience. And as a reminder from yesterday, climate resilience is really the objective of the TCFD. It's to make companies more resilient, to be able to adapt and mitigate a lot of these risks and capitalize on these opportunities. So the objective here is resilience, but how do we set targets that help us get there? The third learning objective is to understand how a transition plan and net zero targets can be implemented. And then finally, identify how the TCFD's recommendations can be used with other key tools and frameworks to create resilient and agile strategies. So with that, let's get into a bit of a recap of what we learned yesterday. So moving great onto this slide, I'm just going to cover that we, of course, have 4 core pillars of the TCFD. And yesterday we went into quite a bit of detail onto governance and strategy, but it's important to see these 4 core pillars really holistically. As a reminder to everyone, the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, that's what TCFD stands for, are really a set of recommendations that this task force put forward as being what companies should be disclosing to the market related to climate. And as a reminder, in that acronym, we have financial disclosures as the last 2 letters there, and that's really key here. So these are meant to be disclosures or information that companies should be disclosing to the market that are able to make that connection between climate and finance. We want to understand how a company is ensuring its financial stability, not necessarily how they're impacting the environment, although that will impact their financial stability in some instances, So what we're looking at here is really how the environment's impacting the company and how that company's preparing for those impacts that they foresee. So these 4 core pillars can really be broken down this way. So governance is really looking at kind of that high level accountability. As many of you know, the board of a company really are kind of the guardrails that keep the company moving in the right direction. So if we're going to integrate climate related risks and opportunities into organizational operational decisions, as well as their strategic decisions, we need the board to set that tone from the top. So really that's that oversight and accountability we want to see. And in order for an effective strategy that reacts effectively to climate change and the financial impacts that come from that, we need to make sure that it's really set from the top at the board level. So we have 2 disclosures that are recommended in the governance section, which we went over yesterday as being the management of climate related risks and opportunities. And the management is anyone in your senior management level who makes the decisions related to climate. And then the board level. So understanding what the board role is, and importantly, the communication between the 2. And then in strategy, we're really looking at that action and the impact that we want to see. How are you prepared and how are you integrating this into your strategic decisions? And again, we had 3 recommended disclosures in the strategy. And for those who weren't with us last time, we went through that and gave some examples of that. But in the strategy component, what we really want to understand here is we want to understand what are the risks and opportunities that have a financial impact on organization. We call those financially material risks and opportunities. And then what are the impacts? We really need to understand how it's going to financially impact our organization. For example, rising sea levels, the physical risks, but also those transition risks of maybe policy changes or regulation changes. We also, in the strategy component, the 3rd component of that is we want to understand how you're foreseeing changes in the future. You might remember we were talking about the different time horizons that we see in climate change, and how we need to kind of adjust our vision as an organization to be understanding how decisions that we make today will have an implication with a different environment in the future. So we need to be able to be looking at the short term, the medium term, and the long term. So the strategy integrates a tool called a scenario analysis tool, which we were discussing last time. And it's really like a stress test that many of you are probably very familiar with. And what we're doing is we're testing kind of different futures that might happen and trying to understand how our organization will thrive in those particular situations. Today, we're going to go to those second 2. So in risk management, it's really understanding the processes that allow us to be able to identify those risks and opportunities and the impact of those risks and opportunities. And then also the metrics and targets, which allow us to measure how we're doing and kind of understand our progress over time. It's important to understand those all linked together, but we'll go through them individually today too, so that we understand the specific disclosures that you're asked to disclose by the TCFD. So yesterday we did discuss a lot of risks. So I'm just gonna set a little poll here to ask you all a bit of a quiz, see who was here yesterday and who was paying attention. So what elements of a climate scenario are relevant when exploring transition risk? So try to think back to what a transition risk was from yesterday's course. So would we be considering in our scenarios that are looking at transition risks, would we consider carbon prices? Would we consider sectoral emissions? Would we consider sea level rises and or economic indicators such as GDP and GVA? So I'm just going to leave you with that for a moment, and not to worry. It's not recorded who says what. We just want to check all of that. Okay. So 10 more seconds for anybody else who wants to share. And I'd have to say you're all doing very well. So it looks like a lot of you had participated yesterday. Okay, I'm going to end the poll now. Great. So you are correct. All of them are transition risks except for sea level rise, which is a physical risk. So when we're doing scenarios, we'll often look at physical risks separately than transition risks. So it's important for us to understand the difference between those different types of risks. And as a reminder from yesterday, those physical risks can be both acute, severe weather events and hurricanes and tornadoes and flooding, but then they can also be chronic risks that happen over time and compound over time, and that would be something like sea level rises, which will often come from an increase in temperature. Okay, so great job, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing that and let's keep going. Okay, so another important reminder from yesterday. So climate-related financial disclosures that are in alignment with the TCFD's recommendations, which as a reminder comes from the Financial Stability Board, should have certain characteristics. The first is where they appear. So as a reminder from yesterday, the TCFD provided these recommended disclosures to appear in our mainstream annual financial filings. So we really want these to come in our financial reporting package in the same way that we often have, your financial statements that come along with explanatory notes. It'll often be, a note from the board. It'll often be a description of governance processes, a description on certain strategic decisions that are being made, etc. Together with that, we also want to include any of this qualitative and also quantitative information that we're providing that gives more light to the climate angle, understanding those climate-related risks and opportunities. However, how you include that in that particular section of your report is not prescribed by the TCFD. It's really up to the organization to identify kind of what that impact is, where it impacts the organization, and then applying it in the reporting process in the most appropriate place that it will make most sense to the report reader. Also, what is included in the TCFD's disclosures is really what is financially material. So the TCFD has indicated that they find, the task force has found that certain pillars are financially material or they have a financial impact for all organizations. So that is the governance pillar, which we discussed yesterday, as well as the risk management pillar, which we'll be discussing today. So already you have 5 disclosures that all companies should be disclosing. The 2 governance and the 3 risk management disclosures should be relevant for all companies because these are really those processes and practices that are in place that ensure that a company can be sustainable or resilient vis-a-vis climate change. Then on top of that, they've also considered GHG emissions. So that's part of our metrics and targets pillar that we'll be discussing later, to also be material to all organizations. So they believe that scope 1 and 2 emissions should be disclosed by all organizations, and we'll discuss a little bit more of the scopes later as well. But those are really the emissions that you have the most control over. And then there's an importance to also look at scope 3, which is in your value chain, understanding kind of the hotspots and understanding where the risks are related to your supply chain as well. So those ones right out the gate, all companies should be considering financially material or having a financial impact. And any other information, particularly in that strategy pillar, as well as the other metrics and targets, should always have a materiality lens applied to them. So whether or not something is financially material. And just a quick reminder of what financial materiality is, it's any information that would adjust a decision, a financial decision. So for either investors or economic decision makers, if this information was added to the report and it might alter the decision-making process, then it indeed is financially material. Okay. So moving on to the disclosure of financial impact. This slide, I'm going to breeze through pretty quickly just in the interest of time, but this comes straight from the TCFD's guidance. And I think it's important just to kind of sum it all up, what we talked about yesterday. So you can always come back to the slide as a bit of a reminder of those risks that we see. We have transition risks and we have physical risks that have certain categories that the TCFD recommends that all companies discuss or at least identify the financial materiality to their own organizations. And then there's the opportunities, of course. And as we discussed yesterday, those opportunities can really outweigh the risks. So don't forget the opportunities. Those then feed into the strategic planning and the risk management processes. And then finally, that's where we have the financial impact on the organization. And that financial impact shows up in our income statements, our cash flow statements, and our balance sheet. So we can see them hitting our revenues, our expenditures, our assets and liabilities, our capital and financing. So that's a quick summary of how we see those risks and opportunities reaching our organization financially, having that financial materiality, which is key to how we decide what is included in our disclosures. Another important aspect of the TCFD is because it is not prescriptive exactly how it shows up. It's not like the GRI standards, which give you kind of a standard number and then you fill that in, or the CDP questionnaire where you answer particular questions. These guidelines are really ensuring that you have the correct processes and practices in place to be able to mitigate and adapt to climate-related risks and opportunities. So it's important to make it easy enough for investors to find, and you might also want to talk to your clients that you're working with and that you're giving loans to about making sure that this information is easy enough to find for yourselves. We often highlight something that we're seeing as a trend now in having kind of a TCFD table in annual disclosure. So this is an example here from a bank, which has just really lined out those 4 core pillars along with the 11 recommended disclosures on the left-hand side under TCFD recommendations. And then they indicate where they can find this information, what page it's in, and then additional guidance documents that you might be able to find. Just as a reminder, this is also a good gap analysis tool, because if it's not included in any of your disclosures currently, or if it's being included only in a sustainability report and not in your annual financial package, then you need to discuss, internally, what is the materiality of that information and should it indeed be brought into your annual reporting package. Great. And just before we have another quick quiz, here's a few tips that you can use as you're implementing the TCFD recommended disclosure. So attempting to align your disclosure practices with the recommendations of the Financial Stability Board. So the first one is really that you need to figure out where you are. So before getting started, we really highly recommend doing a gap analysis. Now you can use the SSE's model guidance on climate disclosure in Annex 1. We provide a TCFD checklist, and companies often find this helpful to be able to do a gap analysis. You can have anyone in the organization do that because it's really dependent on what is publicly available. So what information can be publicly found about your company in your annual reporting package pertaining to these 11 core disclosures. So you can have anyone do that gap analysis, but then you need to identify kind of what information you might already have, but it's not being disclosed, and what information you need to start collecting. From there, you can set up a roadmap and you can update and develop climate policies and set targets. Then another really important tip is to get internal buy-in. You'll hear tone from the top a lot. I think governance really sets it really quite clearly. The 2 core recommendations we see from governance are really essential. So to be able to get that internal buy-in, we suggest identifying really those financial impacts of climate risk, making that the high point of what we're really looking at here is materiality, is shareholder impact, is profit. We want to make sure that we're continuing to be profit as an organization moving forward, but climate risk does affect all organizations, so it's important that we're prepared for that. Also, upskilling the board, management, and leadership is quite important to get internal buy-in, making sure everybody's understanding not just the impacts of climate change, but how our company can respond to that. And then bringing in external expertise can often be helpful, and establishing accountability and incentive structures internally. The third tip is collaboration. In our other training program, TCFD 101 and 102, which is an introduction to the TCFD for all listed companies, you can find those videos on our website. But we talk a lot about a TCFD team, and really starting out with some core staff members from different departments in the organization working together to move this forward. But collaboration is essential. One of the key ways of integrating this into your report is making sure that you have it understood throughout all the report preparers. But to do that, all the divisions need to understand how climate-related risks and opportunities might impact their specific division. So collaboration is really key there. And then we also have learning from others. Now, important to remember as you have that collaboration, that it's important to have cross-functional teams, that you set up a climate champion, that you pool expertise and knowledge, and that you actively engage clients. So you can learn both internally within your organization, but learn from your peers as well. And we highly recommend using the TCFD Knowledge Hub for that. That can be a very helpful resource to be able to look for other companies that might be similar to yours, and making use of their reports to see how they're doing. So I just saw someone said, could you please explain what does internal buy-in mean? Thanks for that. I don't always see the chat, so sorry if I'm missing some of the other ones, but I did notice that one pop up. So thanks, Alan. So internal buy-in really means you want your board or your leadership to really understand the purpose of why you want to integrate climate-related risks and opportunities into your strategic planning and your operational decision-making, and to get them to buy into this, to understand why it is so important. You often need to do some kind of training and upskilling. You need to make very clear what the financial impacts of climate change are on the organization. So by internal buy-in, what we really mean that the governance on board, the board members, the leadership, really behind this process, because if they're not supporting, a shift in understanding your climate time horizons, then it's never going to work. It's never going to be integrated strategically. I hope that makes that a little bit clearer. Okay, so great. Thanks, Alan. Let's do one more quick quiz here before we move on to our risk management. Okay, so you should have this poll pop up on your screen now. So based on our intro now, disclosure of material, so financially material climate-related financial data should appear where in your reporting package. So just a quick quiz to make sure we had everybody get that key point there. I'll give you maybe 30 seconds to fill that in. Okay, I'm going to end the poll in 5 seconds with the last few answers in there. Okay, bravo. That was a great job, everyone. So yeah, the majority of you said in your annual financial reporting package for investors, 100%, that's where we want to see this information. Now, you're not wrong, those of you who said sustainability report or climate report. And you'll often see it in both. What's important is that it does appear in the annual financial report package. Any material information should appear in that annual financial reporting package, but then you might also create a climate report, a separate climate report, and you'll likely include a lot of this information in your sustainability report as well. For those who are creating a separate climate report, those are usually companies that consider climate to be a particularly important topic for their stakeholders. So they've done a stakeholder analysis. They understand that their key stakeholders are quite concerned about climate risks. and opportunities. This will often be, for example, oil and gas companies that recognize really the impact that climate change and climate regulation particularly are going to have on their organization. So they might create an extra report to really make very clear their stance and what they're doing to move forward. But it's important it's not only appearing there. It should also appear at least the 11 recommended disclosures that are financially material in your annual financial reporting package. Great. So two people said on your website, also okay to add it to your website. However, it shouldn't be the only place, making sure that first and foremost, it's appearing in your financial reporting. Great. So with that, let's look at the next pillar. Well, we're going to, of course, keep opportunities in mind as we do this. And those who remember last time we did discuss financial opportunities with this report that was by CDP. It was launched in 2019. It was called Major Risk or Rosy Opportunity. And we discussed there how the opportunities identified companies actually far outweighed in dollar amounts the risks facing opportunities. So let's not forget about opportunities, but we are going to focus here a little bit on the risk management. So let's discuss kind of risk management, particularly for banks. We currently see here on the screen an overview from the Network for Greening the Financial System, which really illustrates risks that could affect the economy and financial system through a range of different transmission channels. This overview really helps us to understand impacts, financial impacts that we want to see, or we don't want to see, actually, that we want to prevent. So if you now look at the left-hand side of this slide that's in bright green, we have a dichotomy of climate risks. So that's split into transition and physical risks as we've been discussing a lot. And then if you move into the middle in that gray box, you can see the different transmission centers, which takes both a micro and a macro view. And on the right-hand side, you can see that they actually can lead to financial risks for the financial system or micro risks within the organization. And if you focus on that one first, we can see, for example, how consumer preferences are altering in the micro perspective effects on businesses through changes in demand for certain products, which then amplifies then is amplified then by household changes, such as changes in costs. And at the same time, it can influence employee satisfaction, impacting production and also costs related to production, which all creates financial risk for lenders and investors. So this all really is quite interconnected, but to help you understand the knock-on effect that we can see here. Maybe if we look then at physical risks, we might see an increase in acute risks, such as an extreme weather event like hurricanes, which can then impact productivity at the macro level, but it will also increase costs for an organization at the micro level for both households and for businesses. For the financial side, underwriting risks increases as insuring assets may become more difficult or more costly, as physical risk can possibly lead to lower insurance coverage in some regions. And also, if you look at the bottom of the slide, we see this little gray line, and this is actually creating a feedback cycle. So this can really mean that the financial impacts can then have an economic impact, a more macro impact, and that at the same time, those economic impacts of the country's transition to a net zero low carbon economy will then increase that impact as well. So it's important to see this as really a cyclical nature. So this is a good resource you can use as you're starting to look at what are the impacts that are hitting a bank. Here's another really good resource, and a top question that we're really asked is, what are the risks? And how do you measure these risks, and what should you focus your attention on? Of course, the TCFD outlines key risks, but this is a really good tool you can use from Unipify. This is the result of one of Unipify's TCFD banking programs projects from a few years ago, which was designed by the members of Unipify's TCFD banking program to really help financial institutions to expand their toolkits for climate risk assessment and also to use it for disclosures. And as I think everybody already knows, every sector really brings different challenges or obstacles with this green transition or a transition to net zero or low carbon economy. And because portfolios are often quite diverse, Unipify's banking program made a decision to come up with these 8 sectors in order to summarize the risk profiles of each of them. And here you can see the ratings and the heat map for each of those 8 sectors, which are on the left-hand side there. And the mapping, therefore, reflects kind of the level of risk that the participants believed at the time are likely to occur from an ambitious or a just transition under the scenario of limiting the warming to well below 2 degrees, which is in line with the Paris Agreement from 2015. So a heat map is generally a really great tool for starting to evaluate and disclose and manage your risks. So that's another great tool that you can use as a bank. And another report that a lot of banks are also referring to more and more is this interesting report by Carbon Tracker. And as many of you might know, it has been shown that in order to limit global warming to that 1.5 degree target that we really have set out as global nations as an increase from pre-industrial temperatures. In order to achieve that, then 90% of fossil fuel reserves must remain in the ground. So of those reserves that oil and gas companies and organizations have recognized that they already have found and are part of their assets, 90% of them cannot be taken out of the ground if we're going to, with the current technology we have, if we're going to achieve that 1.5. So this report, Unburnable Carbon, 10 years on, finds that the majority of embedded emissions are actually listed on certain stock exchanges. They find them in China, the USA, India, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, where with the exception of the US, emissions are dominated by the partial listing of state-owned companies. So this report really quantifies the stranded asset risk exposure for the oil and gas assets and finds that over $1 trillion of oil and gas assets are at risk of being stranded, meaning they can't be taken out of the ground. And the majority, so more or less 600 billion, is held by listed companies on stock exchanges. So in absolute terms, this stranded asset risk is concentrated in certain financial centers, such as New York, Moscow, London, and Toronto. So that's another great publication that you can use. So before we go into the TCFD's recommended disclosures, I just wanted to flag this as an example. I'm not going to spend much time on it because I'm already past my time somehow. But just to note, this is an example that the city of Calgary, a city in Canada, has published a few years now. I think it's from 2018, but it helps us understand kind of that where we get that resilience as an organization. So they have on one side mitigation, on the other side adaptation, and in the center, that's where we really become resilient as an organization, where we're mixing both mitigation and adaptation. So that's a good starting point also for many of you who are starting to integrate this into your strategic decision-making processes. Okay, so with that, let's look at managing climate risk. So we're going to look at the third pillar of the TCFD's recommended disclosures, risk management. And just to remind you where it sits, it sits kind of in the middle here. So it's interconnected, it's not separate, but really what we want to understand here is the processes used by the company to identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks. So let's look at a quick checklist of what information we want to provide here. So what we can see is that the risk management pillar contains really 3 broad recommended disclosures, as you can see on this slide, A, B, and C. And then there's additional or supplemental guidance in category A, which, as you might remember from last time, there's 11 recommended disclosures from the TCFD, but then there's supplemental or additional disclosures for certain sectors, and the banking sector is one of those sectors. So in category A, the risk identification and assessment processes, the recommended disclosure is really about describing those processes in place for risk management that allow an organization to identify and assess climate risk. So all organizations should be considering disclosing how risks are identified and explaining the methodology used. So for example, if you are not using the risk categories provided by the TCFD, which we've been discussing kind of at length, those transition risks and those physical risks, you should be explaining why not and how you compare different risks. So in doing this, it should be understood by the report readers how regulation is considered when evaluating risks related to traditional risk categories used by banks. For example, how climate risk impacts credit risk, the market risk, liquidity risk, and operational risk. Then in category B, risk management processes, we're focusing here on the organization's managing and prioritization of risk. And this is the information on how decisions are being made in terms of risk management. So as in part one, in the governance section, we were talking about how in governance, we want to understand who is actually doing the decision making and who is responsible for assuring risks are effectively managed, which might be people specifically or teams. In risk management, what we're really asking is how those decisions are being made and what information is being drawn on to make those decisions. And then finally, in category C, integration, this is focused on integrating climate-related risk into our overall risk management processes. And this helps us understand not just prioritization of climate-related risk, but prioritization of climate risk vis-a-vis other non-climate risks. And it also helps us understand, as a report reader, how the management views climate risks and how climate risks are then integrated into the risk management system. Two important aspects here to remember is that climate is a non-diversifiable risk. So it's widespread, it impacts all organizations, so it should be considered throughout the organization. However, at the same time, it's slightly different from other risks in that it has quite a long time horizon. So it does need to be dealt with slightly different than other risks. So we want to see it integrated, but we also want to recognize that it is different to an extent so that it's appropriately integrated into the strategy. So you can take a look at this on your own, but just going back to that TCFD status report, really great report to look at how other companies are doing. But as we can see here, in all three categories, there has been a progressive increase in disclosure here. Also to note that in category C, the integration into overall risk management, it's increased the most since the 2019 status report. This is significant as it's actually the greatest increase in disclosure from 2019 to 2021 of all the 11 recommended disclosures, which range from a 5% increase to about a 20% increase here. And that's good because that's also one that banks are doing particularly well on now too. So how does climate risk fit in the holistic ESG portfolio? We get this question a lot. So if we're emphasizing so much the integration of climate risk into broader risk management, it's important to also understand how climate change fits within the broader ESG space. And for those not familiar with this term, ESG stands for environmental, social, and corporate governance. And climate change naturally is often considered in the component of E, environmental. And ESG trends or tends to be used as an investment term, which considers a company's or portfolio's group of companies' management of environmental issues, social issues, and their governance structures, which can, of course, indicate how risky or stable or volatile that particular company or group of companies are. But in addition to climate change, environmental issues go beyond what is included in the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, also considering environmental degradation and biodiversity loss, such as that which is covered in the TNFD, which is the nature one. So just to note that it goes beyond that. But also to note that investors are increasingly implying these non-financial factors as part of their analysis process to identifying material risk and also growth opportunities for companies. But what I do want to highlight here is how they are interconnected. We know that climate change has really far-reaching implications, and there is an open question whether climate action has outgrown the ESG mandate and needs its own. And this is why we see the TCFD and TNFD being so aligned, as well as highlighting the importance of climate within the environmental part of ESG. Even beyond the environmental pillar, however, we have already discussed how climate change can impact markets, help us to understand the impact on consumers, how it impacts reputation, employees, etc. So it does go beyond environment in terms of what we're looking at and risks and opportunities. So although the ESG landscape helps us to understand the various different non-financial considerations that investors are considering, climate change is impacted by and can impact various parts of this framework, including the social and governance components. So let's look at how we might see a few of these disclosures come out in practice. The first example here is a disclosure from HDFC, which is an Indian bank, and it is taken from their sustainability report. And just to remind everyone that the sustainability report might have a lot of this information, but the objective is really to get this into our annual financial report package. But what I think they have done really nicely here, or what we can see on this example here, is really to lay out the anticipated risk exactly as categorized by the TCFD. And while this is just a snapshot of the transition risk side, if you open the report, which you can do in the handout, you will see that they also did this for the physical risk side. And what they did is they are not only describing what the risks are that are identified, but more importantly, they're in line with the recommendations of the TCFD, and they're describing how the company identifies those risks and opportunities and how they actually manage those risks. So, for example, we know from this clip on the screen here that the operational risk management department designs tools and techniques for identification and monitoring operational risks. And we can see that in this table of anticipated risks associated with climate change, where they identify the risk as well as how they're managing that risk. We can read in the first risk, legal risk, that all large projects are required to comply with environmental laws, for example. What I think is also interesting to see in this snapshot here is how we can see the interconnectedness of the different pillars. So we discussed a lot, the pillars in silos, but we're getting information in this little clip here about how the committees are set up, which is pertaining to the governance disclosure recommendation, but also then how it is working to give us more information about the risk itself. So like I said earlier, the TCFD does not prescribe where the information needs to appear. It can be all together as long as that information is clear and that we understand those governance processes, the risk management processes, how it integrates in strategy, and what our targets are. So let's look at another example here. I have a few more minutes, so I think I should be able to get through another couple. So this example is from ABN AMRO, which is a Dutch bank, which has integrated aspects into their annual report here through an integrated reporting framework. So they're using an integrated report frame, which you might remember is kind of in quite good alignment with the TCFD because it integrates this information together with financial information. This example illustrates how sustainability risk policy frameworks are integrated into their enterprise risk management framework using a risk taxonomy. What's particularly good here is that it defines conditions under which the bank's business generally works. And what I do want to highlight here in particular is that the sustainability risk is considered a financial risk, but some aspects of the TCFD's risk categories go beyond financial risks into operational or non-financial risks, such as legal risks, behavioral risks. So the TCFD would be addressed beyond this single financial risk component here. They also indicated that in 2022, they assessed the materiality of climate-related and environmental risks in relation to their traditional risk types. And the initial assessment was qualitative. I do recommend opening this up if you're in this beginning phase and learning from their process a little bit. For some risk types, this was then further substantiated quantitatively, whereby a distinction between materiality in the short term, medium term, and long term was made. And they defined short term as 1 year, medium term as 5 years, and long term as in within 30 years. And then to ensure consistency across risk types, they looked at a set of predefined events, including climate-related risk events such as floods and droughts and policy and technology development, etc. And they even further discuss in the report the outcome of this assessment. So that's they're very clear about how they went through that process, and it's a good learning opportunity for other organizations as well. And then I'm going to skip this one. Well, give me just a few more minutes. I know I'm getting over time already, but this one's, I think, important. It's a Brazilian bank, Banco do Brasil, and they are showing their materiality metrics. And we see these a lot, but I think what's really interesting in this one, and you might want to open up the report for, is they explain how they did kind of a cycle of consultation and their stakeholder analysis in order to get here. Ooh, pardon me. So they conducted this stakeholder analysis with a lot of different stakeholders, and they really gained information through consultation surveys, through discussing it with a lot of different stakeholders, through a media analysis, through looking at trends, different studies, and they use that to help them understand what key areas they needed to look at and what influence they were having. So that's a good stakeholder analysis process that you could look through too, by looking at the Banco do Brasil report there. Okay, and then this final one, I might leave you all to look at on your own. Just as a reminder, in your handout, we do have a bit of extra details on each of these examples so that you can see what kind of the best practice are there, and then the link if you want to open this up as well. But this final one is quite interesting because it's it's in their sustainability report, or the corporate social responsibility report, but it really looks at both transition and physical risks leading down into that financial impact that we've been talking about. Okay, and just before wrapping up this section, I just wanted to flag Unipify's 2023 climate risk landscape report. This is a useful tool that anyone can make use of, particularly in the banking sector. And along with this, you can find an Excel summary of several service providers and their transition risk assessment tools and analytics. And the information incorporated in this overview has been obtained from publicly available sources, survey responses, or contributions from most climate assessment service providers following the 2021 landscape report. So we gave you a few of these tools last time, but just to remind you that this is a really good tool you can use as you're starting to identify those risks and opportunities. And just in the note of time, I'm going to skip over this one, but you can peruse it in your own time in your handout, but it's additional information on what you can use from that, the Unipify's toolkit there. And with that, over to you, Vanina, on the metrics and targets.
Thank you, Tiffany. And so I'm Vanina Vegetsi from the SSC. You've seen me yesterday. Happy to be with you again to walk you through the last pillar, namely the metrics and target pillar. Before the break, yeah, I'll try to be brief. So you can see it here, it's highlighted in gray. Just as a reminder, the metrics and target pillar of the TCFD is that very inner layer of the TCFD. And all of the other pillars are underpinned by these metrics and targets. And Tiffany was mentioning that earlier, that they are developed and created through that materiality lens, meaning that the metrics and targets really need to be grounded in climate information that is financially material. And this fourth pillar is about disclosing the metrics and targets really used to assess and manage climate-related risks and opportunities. So let's break this down into 3 disclosures that are recommended by the TCFD. As we've seen last time, there are general requirements and then additional requirements for banks. We'll begin with the first category here, A, that's metrics. So we have a list of country industry metrics that are important to all organizations, including banks. They have to disclose on transition risks, physical risks, climate-related opportunities, internal carbon prices, and remuneration. And then on top of that, it's also important to disclose any sort of assumption or methodologies used to come up with the metrics that you're disclosing. So then for banks in particular, we have in this first recommendation, 3 pieces of guidance that banks should be addressing. Firstly, banks should report on the metrics for their lending and financial intermediary business activities. Secondly, they should report on their carbon-related assets. And then thirdly, it's recommended that banks report on their performance in aligning with a 2-degree or lower scenario. And here it's just making sure to connect strategy disclosures and risk management disclosures with metrics. In other words, it's how you're using a scenario analysis to inform the sort of metrics you're developing and how you're tracking that over time. Then let's go to the second row. So the second category, B, which is the greenhouse gas emissions, And it's very important because they are really relevant in relation to the climate change. So greenhouse gas emissions are specific metrics that the TCFD deems to be financially material for all organizations. In other words, it's important to inform how many emissions are in your portfolio, which will have a financial impact on any bank. And here it's recommended that all companies, even beyond banks, should disclose Scope 1, Scope 2, and if relevant, Scope 3 emissions using the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. That's the recommended methodology from the TCFD. Let's do a quick overview. What are these 3 scopes? Scope 1 are the direct emissions, those that a company causes by operating what it owns or controls. So for example, it can be a result of running machinery to make products or just heating buildings or powering computers. Then we have Scope 2, and these are indirect emissions. They are created by the production of the energy that an organization buys, for example, installing solar panels or sourcing renewable energy. Then we have Scope 3, and these are also indirect emissions, meaning they are not produced by the company itself, but they differ from Scope 2 because they cover those produced by customers using the company's products or those produced by suppliers, making products that the company uses, for instance. So you may note that I said organizations should disclose Scope 3 only if relevant. But for banks, these Scope 3 emissions are likely to be very highly relevant. So it's important to look at the 3 scopes and not just the first 2. So with that, there's specific guidance for banks, as you can see, to report on greenhouse gas emissions from lending and other financial intermediary business activities. And that using the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, referred to as PCAF methodology. The final recommended disclosure is the target. So we are on the last row here, that's letter C. It's recommended that all companies should report on long-term as well as interim targets, considering absolute and intensity-based calculations, timeframes, base years, and key performance indicators. So just to clarify again, we sometimes get questions about absolute versus intensity emissions. So absolute emissions are the gross overall emissions associated with an organization. And then intensity emissions refer to an organization's emissions relative to some sort of economic output, such as the revenue. So again, with the targets, as with the others, we see it's important to report and disclose what methodologies you're using to come to the conclusions that you are around the targets. So I took some time here, but I think it was important for you to get this through, and maybe I'll skip some of the examples. But here we have this report that Tiffany also mentioned earlier. It's just to see the progress on these 3 disclosures we just saw. As you can see, The percentage of companies reporting across all three recommended disclosures range between around 40 to 50% in the last fiscal year. So again, we have these three colors for 2019 and 2020 and 2021. So we just wanted to highlight this last row about climate-related targets, where you can see that there's a big increase also, and it indicates that companies are really recognizing the importance of setting these targets to manage the risks and opportunities that they might be identifying. Next, we have some examples finally, so hopefully this will help you see how we can disclose on metrics and targets. Please note that everything you see is in your handout, and you also have additional information. You also have the links, so you'll get more context in the handout that has been shared in the chat already. So here, that's the standard bank group. And this screenshot shows how the bank reports the impacts of climate-related risks in its portfolio. So here they have metrics for sectors with elevated transition exposures, such as coal-fired power generation and oil and gas. That's the first row here. Then they also have metrics for sectors with elevated physical risks. Here is the agricultural sector, which is very vulnerable to both acute and chronic risks. And then importantly, we have this last row here. They start to disclose metrics for opportunities. You can see it because they look specifically into opportunities created through climate mitigation in the renewable sector. And next, we have an example from the Bank of China. On the left-hand side, you have a description outlining some of the Bank of China's climate-related targets. And in the diagram, you can see that the proportion of total credits to brown industries accounts for around 10% of their corporate loans. And you have on the side what this 10% includes with the colors: coal, chemicals, for instance, steel, etc. So why is this important? This helps us investors to understand the exposure of the Bank of China's lending to high risk sectors, and how they're really performing and managing these risks over time. Then let's go to another report, another example from the Bank of England. That's a roadmap for reaching net zero from 2000. So they are starting in 2022 and they're going until 2050. So this is a pathway which can be relevant because it provides banks and other financial institutions with a clear picture of the pace and direction of travel for the UK financial system. And this pathway and other jurisdictional pathways can be used to inform your own interim and long-term targets to manage this risk. That's what we've seen in the recommendation slides on the TCFD. So just to note that here, in terms of improvements, is that the net zero targets refers to its physical operations, but not its financed emissions. The bank did indicate that in 2022, they started calculating finance emissions in alignment with PCAF. So then we have a last example here, and I'll just go rapidly. So this is the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development from their 2021 TCFD reports. And here we have a historical record of annual green finance commitments. You see the progress in the trend line from 2006 to 2022, And this shows us the progress of their annual green finance commitment, and it's growing over time. So it helps us understand and track the progress, but it's also in both absolute terms and relative terms. And that's what was recommended. And also important, that's not on the slide, but there is an explanation on how this was calculated. And being transparent in the methodology is something that's really important in the TCFD recommendation. So with all of these examples, I hope now it's a bit clear for you to the ways you can disclose on metrics and targets. So happy to answer any of your questions in the Q&A box, and but it's time for you to take a break of 5 minutes, and so I'll pause for I'll pause now, and we'll start with the second half. Thank you, everyone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back from the comfort break. I hope that you just enjoyed the small little 5 minutes and you get to stretch your body and get a cup of tea or a cup of coffee. And now let's come back to the training session and we'll continue with the next few components. But first, I want to give a few, quick introduction. My name is Wenman Lee, and I'm the program associate working with the Unified TCFD team. Today, I'm here with my colleague Zhongyi and Mahian. So my team will be, typing in the background, busy answering all your questions you put in the Q&A box. While I would be talking you through the next two components of today's training section. So today we're going to focus on net zero target setting and transition plans. Without further ado, let's just dive into our next session and about setting net zero targets. Super. And also, a gentle reminder for you, please feel free if you have any questions, drop that into our Q&A box so that you keep our colleagues busy addressing these comments and questions. Super. So before we talk about how to set net zero targets, it's going to be important for us to understand what is net zero and we know what we're talking about. So here I'm going to quickly play this video, which gives you some nice background information about the whole idea and the reason why we are racing for net zero. So Vanina, if you could play it, super.
Scorching heat waves, record wildfires, rising seas. These consequences of climate change are hitting us already and will do so much harder in the future. To avoid the worst climate impacts, global greenhouse gas emissions need to be slashed in half by 2030 and reach net zero around mid-century. The term net zero gets thrown around a lot these days, but what is it and how can we get there? Reaching net zero emissions requires us to do two things. First, we must reduce our emissions to as close to zero as possible, as quickly as possible. Phasing out coal, investing in clean energy, shifting to electric vehicles, protecting forests, and reducing food loss and waste are just a few ways to shrink our carbon footprint. Second, we need to pull just as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we pump into it. This can be done by planting trees, which absorb carbon into their trunks, limbs, and roots, as well as by deploying emerging technologies, such as direct air capture, which takes carbon out of the air and stores it in geological formations underground. A number of countries have already committed to reach net zero emissions by 2050, and some nations are even more ambitious. For example, Norway plans to reach net zero by 2030, and Finland by 2035. In 2020, all countries should put forward stronger national climate commitments that put us on a path to collectively reach net zero emissions by 2050. And in this process, they will ensure a bright future for our children and all life on Earth.
Great. So I personally find it as a really helpful material just for us to understand about the idea of the net zero and why, we're pushing for the global commitment. So basically, the word net zero really refers to a state in which, the greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere are balanced by the removal out of the atmosphere. So net zero is important because, for example, for carbon dioxide emission at least, this is a state, at which the global warming stops. So basically, it really means, we can still keep emitting greenhouse gases as long as we are balancing them by removing the emissions as well. So the important thing is, you equally remove the same amount as you emit. Again, some context of information, the Paris Agreement of the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, has set a limit of global warming to well below 2 degrees, when compared to the pre-industrial level. And we are really trying to pursue an effort to limit global warming by 1.5 degrees by 2050. And this is actually, as we hear Vanina and Tiffany talking about just now, and it's also in line with the latest climate change. So if we move on to the next slide. Oops. Super. And so we get a lot of questions about why we need to limit the warming to 1.5 degrees. So the difference between 1.5 and 2 degree scenario doesn't sound much, right? But just this 0.5 degree decrease, it can cause significant impacts. So on this page, you will see, it's really highlighting the importance of staying in 1.5 and the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees. So according to IPCC's special report, close to 3 times as many people would be regularly exposed to extreme heat than in a 1.5 degree scenario. So we would also lose twice as many plants and vulnerable species and 3 times as many insects underneath a 2 degree scenario. So the importance of achieving net zero by 2050 and controlling the global warming underneath 1.5 cannot be more pronounced. So there are some actions needed. For example, it's better, of course, it's better to not emit, not to pollute in the first place. So rapid and deep cuts would be a priority. And these are necessary, but actually not sufficient, of course, as we are already reaching a global warming level of 1.1 or 1.2 at this moment. Besides, we need to actively remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to balance out any hard to mitigate residual emissions that must happen. Also, of course, the balance between carbon emissions and carbon removals needs to happen globally around 2050. Otherwise, we cannot collectively make the efforts if countries are not on the same page. Super. So if we understood the meaning and the importance of net zero, let's take a further step and then discuss how financial institutions, especially banks, can set a robust net zero strategy. So before we dive into these different components, I just wanted to highlight that there are many elements to consider throughout the whole process. For example, before you even start calculating the net zero targets, you need to really understand what's the company's vision in setting net zero targets and which parts of the business need to be involved, because it's such a strategic commitment and we basically need everybody to get involved and support this commitment. And again, where a company has to evaluate their financial impact and what are they going to do from a financial planning perspective just to finally reach the target. And how often are you reviewing the targets and how to effectively track them? So overall, it's going to be an iterative, complex process with many considerations. But if we are taking a closer look and if we focus on the target setting process itself, here on this page, we have the material from the SBTI, the Science-Based Target Initiative. There are 5 recommended steps when it comes to target setting process. So you see that the first one is really about select a base year. So the base year is basically the period against which the emissions pathway is compared. So companies really need to establish a base year to track emission performance consistently and meaningfully over the target period. So SBTI is really suggesting that the base year should be chosen to be sufficient and forward-looking ambition, and the base year must be no earlier than 2015. Otherwise, it's not a good representation of the current mapping. And then you will see the second step would be calculate your company's emissions, which is intuitive because you really need to understand where the financial institution currently stands in carbon emitting. You can do that, through evaluations and in order to decide how to move forward. So during this step, you might want to consider, okay, what is the scope of GHG emission inventory? That is to say, if are we only considering carbon dioxide, or are we considering any other GHG such as methane or nitrous oxide? And for bigger institutions, how are we doing the consolidation when it comes to calculations, how are we treating the subsidiaries? Again, many elements to take into account. And if you're interested, you can always find more details in the link inserted in the handout below. But by the end of this step, you should have a total carbon footprint so that you understand how much influence your firm is currently causing. And then the next step, we set target boundaries. So this can really, differ. Basically, it's about, regarding scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. How much are we covering for each of them when it comes to target setting? And this can actually differ from near-term and long-term targets. For example, for near-term, science-based targets, so namely 5 to 10 years, the SBTi is suggesting that the near-term targets must cover at least 95% of the company-wide scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So in the long term, of course, by 2050, the latest, we have higher expectations. And in order to be consistent with the 1.5 degree commitment, the firm must cover at least 95% of the scope 1, scope 2 emissions, and also 90% of the scope 3 emissions. So yeah, I know it's getting a little bit technical, but for more clarification and for more granular information, please feel free to check the recommendation, provided by SBTi. But then after this step, we actually need to choose a target year, which is straightforward because we want to know by when we want to achieve our final goal. So here I want to address that in addition to an overall target year, for example, my goal is by 2050, achieve net zero across the company level. The TCFD is also recommending to provide targets as well as interim targets. So you can have more granular goals to monitor the progress against the ultimate target. And then last step would be to calculate targets. So how much emissions are we cutting each year? And do you want to present, a cross-sector absolute reduction amount to the stakeholders? Or would you like to maybe start from a small portion of your business and maybe consider sector portfolio first? And maybe if you don't want to, just use absolute emissions, maybe you can consider intensity as well. So just for TCFD disclosure purposes and for the transparency principle, this calculation methodology is really, really important for stakeholders to understand, and it's really should be adequately communicated in the report. So the stakeholders are on the same page how you carry out the calculation. Super. I know that there might be some questions coming up, but first I want to quickly talk through this kind of target setting guidance by TCFD. So basically, this page is showing us what makes effective targets. So in late 2021, the TCFD actually published the guidance on transition plans and target setting. On the left-hand side, you see the effective targets characteristics. There are 7 points. So just conscious of time, I won't read this all up, but instead I'll pick up some interesting points to discuss. For example, the second and the third point is really talking about the target should be linked to relevant metrics, quantified and measurable, so that the stakeholder would understand how the progress is being made, and then see if the objectives are being met along the way. And then the fourth one, of course, the targets need to be clearly defined over time, which means we do not have the baseline, do not only have the baseline period, but also have the interim targets, because they are essentially the checkpoints between the current period and the target and date. And then the last 2 points, of course, you will see periodical review and annual report, because the world changes, business changes, and these are essential ongoing reporting is also necessary just to ensure, each step is on this trip is on the trail and are being met. So on the right-hand side of this slide, here we're presenting you an example of the target of the hypothetical firm. So as you can see on the y-axis, the goal is really about CO2 absolute emissions. And the x-axis actually stands for the timeline. And there you see we have the historical metrics, the current metrics, and forward-looking information. So here, the company baseline is really set at 2020, and the ultimate goal is to reduce the CO2 emissions to 0 by 2050. So you will see the company target path in the dotted blue line in the middle, and also the company is also illustrating other GHG emission pathways provided by different scenarios, such as the NGFS scenarios, the network for greening the financial system. And also we see 4 interim targets in the middle, such as, in 2030, the company should have cut the overall emission by 50% already. 2045, you see the goal is really to reduce it by 90%. Maybe the last highlight on this page, as you see the slope of the company target pathway is really changing. So namely from 2020 to 2035, the emission is decreasing at a higher rate. So basically it's really steep. Maybe in any case, the firm might have some, a few quick wins and can move quickly on this carbon footprint. But then after 2035, you see the reduction is expected to slow down just because it might require a lot of investment and time to move the final chunk. So this is definitely an interesting observation and an important point to communicate in the disclosure if you are, including this in your annual report. Great. So I will just quickly pause here. So just being conscious of time, I don't think we would have the chance to address your questions during the session, but please feel free to drop that into the Q&A box so that our colleagues would ensure that they are answered by the end of our session. And then I'll go to the next page. Here on this page, we see 3 possible methods of target setting. So namely, you can set targets, using absolute finance emissions. You can use physical emission intensity, and you can also use finance emission lending intensity. So absolute emissions, just as its name indicates, it measures how much GHG emissions a company produces. This is actually a very straightforward measurement. And it allows aggregation across different sectors. And also, this is the focus of most NGOs and activists. So the watch points for this metric is, it is hard to compare absolute emissions between different industries and firms of different sizes, because it's simply not fair. Let's say, here we have Bank A, which manages tenfold the assets compared to Bank B. And of course, if you are simply using absolute emissions, it's going to be, not comparable. And it doesn't necessarily give indication of how efficient, banks are doing when it comes to carbon emissions and management. And then we have the physical emission intensity. So this is basically the normalization based on the absolute figure, and it's measuring the attributed quantity of emissions released per unit of production or per unit of the GDP. So if the intensity goes down, that means we're more efficient. So on the one side, this method really increases the comparability, but on the other side, actually, it's making sourcing data more complex. Especially for the sector-specific production data. And finally, we have the financed emission lending intensity. and it is the absolute emission adjusted by total sector financing. So basically, it's really supplementing the watch point of absolute emissions. It's allowing companies with lower emission relative to, relative their size to grow. But here I want to, address that we need to remember that the economy might care about the second and the third intensity measurement, but the atmosphere actually only cares about the first absolute emission. So we can't reduce the intensity while we are, keep expanding the pie. So basically, each type of targets, they will tell you something different about the firm, and it's often necessary to include multiple targets rather than a single one when you are really making the net zero targets. So that's why our Net Zero Alliance require both overall reduction target and intensity-based measure at a sector level. Great. And then we're finally able to show you some concrete examples. We have two here, but I guess being conscious of time, I'll walk you through the first one and then leave the second one as a nice reading material. So again, everything is from the bank's public reports. And if you're interested, please check the handout and click the link for more details. Here we have the Citibank 2021 TCFD report, and we extracted the net zero target setting example. Here you can see Citi is listing 5 steps of their target setting process. So basically, you can see them in the first chart, from calculating emissions to scenario selection, pathway selection, and target setting, and then to implementation and external engagement. So the engagement is definitely a highlight because throughout the whole process, Citi is involving external stakeholders and addressing the feedback from their clients and investors. So overall, these steps are actually very familiar to the idealized steps we mentioned a few minutes ago, provided by SBTI and TCFD recommendations. And in the chart below, we can also see Citi's 2030 emission targets. So basically, the first column shows the sector. You see they are really starting from the energy and power sector. And then they're actually using 2020 as baseline, as you could see in the second column. In the third column, actually, they picked the climate scenario. And then in the fourth column, they defined the 2030 targets. So here I want to, address one point, just because we're always getting asked why power is, Citi is only considering scope 1 for power sector, but for energy sector, it's, considering all 3 scopes. So basically, scope 1, as Vanina just mentioned, it's measuring the direct emissions, mainly, resulting from operations. So the power sector doesn't have significant downstreams. So emissions from power sector are mainly coming from the generation, so to say, the combustion of the fuel. So that's the reason, why we see the divergence here for different sectors. Great. And then, as mentioned, I'll leave this case study by Barclays to you, and you can always check more details in the online report. Then, actually, we have a small interactive exercise to put what you have learned into practice. It's actually going to be about developing a transition plan for financial institutions. But before we do the exercise, I just want to quickly talk about, how to develop a transition plan and what are the good practices throughout the process. So the transition plan is actually at a higher level when it compares to the net zero target setting process we just, discussed maybe a few minutes ago, because the net zero target setting is actually one of the components of this strategy to address its climate-related risks and opportunities. So Here, the transition plans should really lay out a set of targets and action supporting its transition towards a low carbon economy, and including actions such as reducing GHG emissions. Here, the TCFD guidance really highlights certain key practices in developing a transition plan. So there are 7 steps again, very similar to target setting process and good practices we just talked about. But the first one you see aligned with strategy, which means the transition plan should really be a part of and aligned with the company's overall business strategy and aligned with other efforts for addressing the climate-related risks and opportunities. And second one, credible. Of course, it should, contain sufficient information to enable users to assess its credibility and track where you are in terms of transition to a sustainable future. So basically, the plan should really describe the company's current capacities, technologies, transition pathways, and financial plan. And also, if you are facing any challenges regarding GHG emission reductions or hard to decarbonize sectors, you should also communicate that with the stakeholders. And third one, actionable specific initiatives. And of course, this should the plan should really articulate specific action points the organization would undertake just to effectively, carry out the transition plan, including regular milestones. So for example, if the company says, oh, I want to reduce my scope 1 GHG emissions, it does not, it cannot just say that, and instead it should really disclose if it's doing so by investing in new technologies and processes, or by encouraging supplier to reduce GHG emissions in their operations. And then the fourth one, anchored in quantitative elements. So again, we're talking about, including climate-related metrics and targets. So the progress against the company's targets can be regularly tracked by using appropriate metrics. And the fifth one, we have periodical review and updated, which is natural and intuitive to consider. So basically, a transition plan should be reviewed at least every 5 years and updated if necessary. So we can ensure continued relevancy and efficacy to an organization's overall planning process. And 6 points reported annually to stakeholders, which is again appeared in our previous slides. So organizations should really report publicly or to stakeholders first their initial transition plans and then the significant updates to the plans. And in addition, the financial institution should report progress against the transition plan and include a comparison of the completed actions to planned actions in a period, in a prior reporting period. In the end, we actually have the characteristic of subject to effective governance processes. So you see this linking up with our TCFD Pillar 1 recommendations again. Basically, in the transition plan, it should really describe the approval process and the oversight, accountability responsibilities within an organization. So stakeholders understand the role of the board and senior management in overseeing and conducting the plan. Super. And then I hope you're following us, and if you have any questions, please feel free to share them in our Q&A box. Next, we have actually a more concrete example for your reference. So this is actually a disclosure example from Robeco, a Dutch asset management firm, and we now have their roadmap for the transition plan. So as you can see in the timeline, it's really showing the decarbonization pathway, and listing its measure to be taken for each 5 years from 2015 to 2030. And as you can see here, the baseline is really set as 2019, and they set a net zero target for the year 2050. So the commitment is ready to reduce emissions for both investment portfolio and operations. So by 2030, they're expecting to cut 50% of the current emissions, and then the rest half would be addressed in the next 20 years, from 2030 to 2050. So here I wanted to highlight that you see Robeco is really separating the plans for both investment portfolios and operations. You might want to ask why. As we briefly mentioned before, so for financial institutions, there are limited direct and indirect emissions generated from their day-to-day. If we're, generating carbon footprints, it's more about the indirect emissions caused by the investment, lending, and financial activities. So it's ordinary to use Scope 3 emissions and measure the carbon performance for both upstream and downstream. And just because the Scope 3 emissions can account for more than 80% of the company's total emissions and can often be the largest contributor to the overall carbon footprint, Robeco is really separating that from the operations method, from the operation goals when it comes to transition plan. Great. So, here on this page, we also see 6 key areas of action illustrated in the lower left corner. So these are specifically about what they're doing for the investment portfolio transition plan. So if you're interested in checking more details, feel free to go into their online report. There you'll find more context of information. And then we actually are presenting you with another framework on transition plans. This one is developed by GFANZ. So this is an acronym for Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And this one was launched at COP26 in Glasgow in 2021. So this alliance is really a global coalition of leading financial institutions that are committed to accelerating the decarbonization of the economy and to achieving Paris Agreement, the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees by 2050. So the aim is really to deliver real economy emission reductions in line with achieving global net zero. So GFANZ has worked to develop tools and methodologies needed to turn a financial institution's net zero commitments into actions. So here for this framework, specifically talking about transition plans, overall it's still very similar to the previous workflows. So I won't spend too much time on it, but you will see, the foundation is that the bank should, there should be a bank-wide commitment for targets, timelines, and priorities. And then this would be translated into implementation strategy and engagement strategy. And then it's gonna require metrics, targets to assess the, assess and monitor the progress, and then good governance with clear roles, responsibilities, and oversight, just as we saw under the TCFD good practices. So here I wanted to highlight that, in the detailed GFANZ recommendations and suggested disclosures, so this implementation strategy and engagement strategy themes are really accompanying TCFD's strategy disclosure, because these two, they really describe the net zero activities needed to deliver on the financial institution's commitment. And then the GFANZ metrics, targets, and governance components you see in this workflow are really aligning with the TCFD pillars and recommendations. Super. Then I think we're gonna enter the last page of theory before we start the interactive exercise. So this page is really listing 4 key approaches to progress transition to net zero in a real economy. So this one is also output from the GFAN's 2022 report. Basically, these 4 approaches are related to 4 types of companies you might be having as your clients. So you see providers of climate solutions, you see companies that are already 1.5 degrees aligned, you see companies that still need a transition to 1.5 degree, and also you can see companies that need to phase out high emitting assets before their end of life. So for each type, you get different strategies and action points. So for example, for those companies that are already taking proactive actions and being 1.5 degrees aligned, consider providing cheaper funding to them. And then for high emitting clients, the bank can, maybe they can help develop and finance their transition plan. So, then there will be eventually also be assets or, clients where it may be necessary to just divest in the end. So again, on page, on this online document, if you are interested in more information, you can actually find more details on page 12 if needed. Super. So I will quickly pause here just to give you a few moments to type your questions in the Q&A box. But otherwise, I'll just move on to the next page. So here, before we wrap up our session today, we have an activity to just test a little bit of your knowledge, and we want to look into the transition plan strategy together with you and think through the different strategies in different time horizons. So if you want to, participate, feel free to go to menti.com and key in the code 1551. And sorry, I missed the last 4 digits, but you could also do that by scanning the QR code on the screen. So it's 1551-9908 if you are interested in participating. And I'll be giving you several moments just to read the questions and to give your views and opinions. So basically, the first question we're asking is, which strategy mix is best suited when considering a short-term to 2025 time horizon? So here we actually have 4 strategies. You see engagement with high emitting clients. You see divestment from high emitting clients. You see financing a transition of high emitting clients. And then you see expansion of financing climate solutions, for example, carbon removals or bioenergy. Great. I see the first answers coming in. And I'll just be giving you a bit more time so we have enough participants in this exercise. Super, I see people are joining and participating, and the bars and the components are moving around, which is great. I'll wait until the results stabilize a little bit before I share my personal opinions on them. Great. So now I see that expansion of financing climate solutions is really ranking the first. And actually, I totally agree with the prioritized option. This is great to consider because, as Tiffany mentioned, climate also brings related opportunities you can capitalize on. And these financial climate solutions are actually areas we're expecting to see lots of progress in the short to medium run. And interestingly, I see engagement with high emitting clients ranking the last. However, it really, as a financial institution, it's really important to start the discussion, sooner rather than later, just because, this could be repetitive communications coming back and forth. You really need to start talking to clients about how they see their future and how they can reduce their emissions along the way, and to see if they have any transition plan, decarbonization pathway planned. Otherwise, it's really hard to engage them and ensure that the positive changes are happening. And interestingly, we see divestment from high emitting clients actually ranking the third. What I wanted to address is it's a little bit controversial in the sector when it comes to divestment, because in the short run, do you really want to divest yet? And if we do, does it mean that we're only leaving the problem to others? Will it actually, make the change if we divest now without trying to engage them in the first place? So ideally, the divestment would really come after engagement. So it's actually not our first and best solution. With that, Tiff, I'll count on you to move on to the next question. Where we have the midterm time horizon to 2030, and please share with us your views about the strategy we can take when it comes to facilitating a positive transition to a sustainable future. So again, I'll be giving a few moments for you to participate. And we're eager to hear your opinions and views on this related topic. Super. I see that we still like the idea of expanding financial, expanding financing climate solutions, which is still going to bring us some climate-related opportunities in the medium run, for sure. And I see financing the transition of high-emitting clients. The ranking is really increasing, which I totally agree, because we have the decade to really get this right. And these changes need to be happening, in the next few years, because again, we need to think about the transition plan rather sooner rather than later, because it might be cumbersome discussions requested, and it's, time consuming. And divestment probably would become more relevant in the medium term, given you have probably had the first engagement with a client, and the time might come when you need to, have the discussion internally and just to see what do we do now if the client is not ready. Super, if we could move to the last question. Oh, great. Actually, we have answers coming in already, but still, I'll give you some moments to think about a long-term strategy, namely 2040 and beyond. So here we actually still see, expansion of financing climate solution are the most favorable option among our participants. But here I just wanted to highlight that maybe there will still be some activities to do in the climate solution space, but ideally we should have implemented all climate solutions that are available during the previous 2 time horizons. And we see engagement with clients also dropping. This is actually intuitive because the engagement and the discussions should really be happening much earlier instead of 2040, that is 17 years later. So yeah, and then divestment, it's actually becoming most relevant maybe in the long term because even though you don't want to leave the industry just the way it is, you want to facilitate the positive transitions. Still, at some point, you're going to consider the risk of your current securities turning into stranded assets. And you have to maybe at some point leave the industry just because it's getting too risky and the institution won't be able to afford the expenditure to stay. So unfortunately, we don't have the crystal ball on that. So really need to keep monitoring and then keep waiting if what would be the point to divest. Super. With that, I'll hand over to Tiff. Sorry, it's gonna leave you 4 minutes to wrap up, and the floor is all yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Wenmin. Vanina, can we pass? Oh, perfect. Thanks. Okay. Oh, we're all over the place. I got it now, Vanina. Thanks. So we're going to pass through these publications again quickly, but please do make use of the handout, which you've had a few times in the chat box. You also have it in your inbox, so you can make use of all of these great resources available to you. As a reminder, we do have pre-recorded videos available on our website that you can find here on this page, and that'll be linked to in your handout. And I've also put that in the chat box because at the bottom of that page is all the acronyms that you might want to have. I know it is an alphabet soup for sure. And don't forget the TCFD Knowledge Hub, really great resource. You can find tons more case studies in there. You can find lots of publications. Pretty much everything we've shared with you today should be somewhere on the TCFD Knowledge Hub. So do make use of that. And of course, UNEP-FI's resources for banks. You'll find all the links here, how you can have all those great resources. So don't start from scratch. They've done a lot of the research for you. So they've compiled all the tools that you might want to use moving forward. And another few publications that we think are interesting for banks in particular are also in your handout. So you can link to all of these. As a reminder, before we wrap up today, to get your certificate, you need to fill out that Google form. It's a quick survey. It just helps us understand what you learned from this session and how we can continue to improve our training. We really take a lot of that seriously. So please don't hesitate to give us whatever feedback you have. Let us know what other trainings you might need, and we'll continue to adapt for all of your needs. So fill that survey out. Just do it today. It's the easiest. But if you don't do it within a week, you don't get a certificate. So please put that on your list of things to do. Otherwise, you will not get a certificate for this course. And you did spend 2 hours doing it. So we want to make sure you get that certificate. We don't have time, unfortunately, for questions, but we did get to all your questions in the Q&A. So I hope that you left with all your questions answered. I do, however, want to pass to our colleagues. Juan T, are you there, Mr. Juan T? We did want to give you a moment to close out this session and thank again the SME Finance Forum and their team for co-hosting with us. So just checking here. Oh yeah, you're there. Great. So over to you.
Thank you, Tiffany. So just quick word to thank all of you, especially the trainers, yourself, Tiffany, Vanina, Mahin, Jacqueline, Jean-Yi, and Wenmin for this really excellent and it's really rich and insightful training. I managed to follow all the discussion, or probably most of the discussions yesterday and today. There are many useful materials that you shared, and tools, and to me they look very useful, and I hope that all the participants will make use of them. And I would like to thank everyone for spending the last 2 days joining these 2 sessions. I hope you all find it helpful. Please take some time to respond to the survey as Tiffany requested. It's not only just about the requirement for the training certificate, but also it helps us understand the quality of the training, what we should improve for a better training to better serve you in the future. And I don't remember if I mentioned yesterday about the Global SME Finance Forum 2023, which is the annual conference of the forum. And this year it will be in Mumbai from 12 to 14 September. It will be an exciting conference, and I hope that you and colleagues will join us there. And there will be more information on the conference and on future trainings coming up. But for now, I'd like to wish you all a wonderful day and good night to those joining us from Asia. Thank you, Tiffany. Thank you, the team, for this collaboration.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day or evening.
Thank you. Have a good day, everyone.